knows we got a lot of storms in our lives? We have tons of storms. Everybody remember the Xenia tornado? So some of you aren't old enough. When I remember the Xenia tornado, I even remember where I was and what I was doing. I was a tutor at Belmont Junior High School, or actually elementary school up there on Smithville. Tutor in those days, what that meant was I was in trouble with the law, and then they assigned you to a school as a aide, and what you were was a babysitter while the teachers were doing at break in their room, smoking or doing whatever they were doing. In any case, that day I got off of school, and I'm riding the bus home, and I get out, and I lived in Kettering for a short time, and you guys, everybody know where Bob Evans is? So I'm getting off at that Bob Evans, not the Bob Evans that's there now because they've torn the one I got up. Anyway, they tore it down and they built another one, but the other one was built closer to the road. So I started to get out and I walked down that street to my house. And as I'm walking down the street, small hail started. And this all happened fairly quickly. Then the hail got bigger and then it got bigger. And then the hail was so big it was denting cars. I mean, it was big hail. Now what's strange about this, it was April, but it was really warm. In fact, the sun was really shining that day. And we had our jackets off. It was just a beautiful spring day. And this hail started coming down. And it hurt. It was denting cars. It hurt me. At Bob Evans, they had this little overhang. And under that overhang, they had a phone book for you young people, or phone booth. And for you young people, that was, your phone was, there was a cord on it. It was on the wall. You put a dime. A dime is this little piece of change. Anyway, so anyway, I tried to call some people and to get somebody come get me because I'm pretty freaked out. I'm afraid, and all the phone lines are all tied up. It was a scary storm. Now we find out the next day that this Xenia tornado is the largest and still is the largest natural disaster in the United States, as it spurned up 148 tornadoes across the Midwest, and Xenia was hit the hardest. So it was very bad. A lot of people learned a lot of lessons that day. Most people who were around during that time learned a unnatural or natural respect for the weather. So when it starts to get clouded up, and you see somebody that was through the Xenia tornado or any part of it or know about it, and we didn't have the internet and all that stuff, of course, back then. We didn't even really know till the next day how bad it was, but it was devastating. So when it gets cloudy or stormy, some people, you'll notice, get pretty nervous, and it's because they learn from that storm. That storm actually saved my life, but it didn't save my life for 15 years. 15 years later, I was driving down Kiwi Street going to get my son at the babysitters. And I was going up Kiwi, and I was getting ready to go over the bridge there at the river, and there was lightning. It's so bright. I mean, it was, I don't know, it must have hit really close. And then that clap of thunder vibrated my car. It really scared me. And then the wind started to come up. Now, if it wouldn't have been for that storm, I'm sure I would have continued to drive on. But I was pretty freaked out by seeing that. So I turned into, there was a drive-through right there, big, long drive-through. So I pulled into that drive-through, and the wind started coming harder and harder, and it was getting really, really scary. And so I pulled as close as I could to this wall. But the wind was still coming from the south, blocked by that wall, coming so hard, my little truck was shaking. And I was very, very afraid. I really was afraid it was going to roll over. The wind was so hard, I projected that it would roll my truck over and over, up this little embankment, and then down into the river. You know how you project the storms? Even as bad as they are, we can make them worse. So I started hearing these loud cracks, and I could see, the rain was really hard, so you could barely really see in front of you, but you could see these big flashes of light off, and it wasn't, I didn't think it was lightning, but there would be a crack, and then there would be this light, and I was literally terrified, petrified. It went on for about 4 minutes, and it felt like hours. You know how sometimes when you're in the storm, it feels so much longer than it really is. It's like, I'm not going to make it, and then boom! As quick as it started, it stopped. As I was pulling into the parking lot, I saw in my rearview mirror another big flash, and as I was pulling out, I saw what that was. At the Dayton Motor Motel, that I believe is still there, they used to have a great big V-shaped sign there that was actually bolted to the ground. It had blown off and broken off, and there were still sparks. I mean, it was like a movie of a war zone. In this 4 minutes, it had destroyed that area. And so as I moved in and out and around that, I go over to the bridge. And as I get on the other side of the bridge, I see all the telephone poles, or most of the telephone poles, are broken. Those loud cracks I heard were the telephone poles breaking. And they didn't fall across the road. They fell kind of as lengthways. So they were kind of going the road as an upside-down V. And there were sparks, and there was live wires. But I was going after my son, and I was really freaked out, and talk about really projecting. So, what happened? Where there's a house there? And so I'm moving through all those things. And it hit me. Had I kept going on, had I not had respect for the storm, had I not learned my lesson in the storm, I would have kept going, and I would have been on that road as those telephone poles fell and broke off. And more than likely, I would have been dead. We learn from the storms in our lives. If we don't learn from the storms in our lives, we are in big trouble. Sometimes when we're in a storm, though, we project. We think the wrong things. We look at it in the wrong way. Who's the guy's name that plays the pirate from the kids' book? What's the kids' book's name? I wrote it down here. Captain Jack Sparrow. Who's the guy that plays him? Johnny Depp. So I love it. There's this graphic. I didn't send it, or I'd put it up here. In the graphic, it says, the problem is not the problem. Anybody know this? The problem is our attitude about the problem. Let me make sure I said it right. The problem is not the problem. The problem is our attitude about the problem. I quote this a lot, and here's why. Because sometimes we're looking at the problem. God puts us in these storms, and we are looking at the storm instead of the solution. The problem is not the problem. The problem is how we feel about the problem. If we could trust God, we'd have a different attitude about the problem. Is that correct? All right. We hear testimonies a lot. People talk about being saved, and they had this thing happen in their life, that thing happened in their life, and something happened that changed them, that changed their vision of who they were. They couldn't do this, or they couldn't do that. They had a coping problem. I say they have a thinking problem, that they think about what's happening in their life different than what it really, really is. Anybody know that acronym FEAR? Don't anybody say it out loud, because you might know the wrong one. FEAR. Oh, how many people are going to say, which one is he going to say? False evidence appearing real. We do that. We look at the problem, and it might not even be a problem, but we think about it, and we look at it the wrong way, and the storms in our life for a particular reason, and we just overanalyze it, and by the time we have no problem into a really bad problem, or we have a bad problem into a really big problem, that we really didn't need to let it go that far, because that false evidence appeared real to us. Because we didn't trust. We need to trust in God. Does that make sense? That if we could just stop sometimes in the middle of our adversity and pray and think about God, our life would be different. We say it's human nature to worry. I saved that chair for you right there. It's okay. I keep looking, you weren't there. I was like, they went on vacation because I was preaching, so that's kind of nice. God's nature is not to worry. We are in God. I say it every time I preach. He is in us, and we are in Him. And if we are in Him, and we really have the Spirit in us, we won't worry. But we do. Because we look at these storms as a problem instead of a solution, or at least some way to learn. Jeff gave me the title for this. Who knows that Jeff reads all my sermons? We trade sermons. I read his sermon. I say, oh, that's really, really great. And then he reads my sermon, and he gives me a lot of homework to do. So I named the sermon Stormy Weather, but here's Jeff's title, and I love it, and I use it about 300 times. You'll hear it again. God uses the storms of our lives to shape and strengthen us. I say whether they're real or imagined, the storms in our life have a lesson for us. We've been focusing on Abraham, right? Everybody remember? That's been in our series. Abraham's been taught by God not to fear. He's taught tons of lessons. That's why we've been talking about him for so long, because he's just a fountain of lessons. The dude's 100 years old, but for 30 years, he was in school. God taught him to trust him, but it took him a long time. So it's going to take us a long time, too. I mean, like, think about this. If we worry or we have some trust issues because we know of God and we've seen God work through different places and we've even seen God work through us, this dude's talking directly to God, and he's having some issues. He's got so many trials and tribulations. Finally, he gives up, and he trusts God. What's that word called, Jeff? Surrender. I know, that's his favorite word. If Jeff ever gets a tattoo, it's going to be surrender. You're not getting a tattoo, or that's not going to be it? Oh, yeah, okay, I was just checking. All right. Anyway, so he's got all these things. He finally trusts God, and after all the time of mistrusting God and failing all these tests God gave him, he finally gets it right, and God decides to go ahead and give him the present. Everybody knows by now that the present was going to be a son. And that son was supposed to deliver to him, and did, more descendants than there were sand in the desert. That's a lot. First of all, that's a big promise to get a kid. He's 70 years old. I was watching one of, sometimes when Jeff's here, I'm preaching, I'm sleeping, but I would listen to it. Oh, come on, that was a little funny. I listened to his sermons over again, and in one of his sermons, he said something, I missed it when he was giving it, but when I listened to it again, he said, who wants a kid at 70 years old? What kind of gift is that? I get that. Talk about getting a present that's a storm, but for him, it was a great gift because he didn't have any children, and that's how they were measured in his time. If a child to carry on his name, and now we're still talking about him today, so it worked. God gave him the promise in steps, though. He failed so many times, and we know this to be true. When somebody is having a lot of problems and they get it once, we want to make sure it's not like a blind squirrel finds a nut sometime, that it was really on purpose. That was like a blind squirrel that finds it. Jeff says, don't even try jokes because I'm just not funny. And he said the jokes are funny, is that you don't have a delivery. That's the problem. So he gives him the first step of the promise, and he gives him the son, and he's had the son. All right, so he says, let me read from Genesis 22. I think we have that somewhere. Now it came out about after these things that God tested Abraham, and he said to him, Abraham, and Abraham said, here I am. He said, now take your son, your only son, who you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains, which I will tell you. Then they came to the place where God had told him, and Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood. Then he bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham stretched out his hand and took a knife to slay his son. What the heck is going on here? Let's freeze this frame for a minute. Let's think about this. I mean, Abraham, I don't know what he's thinking, but if I'm there, I'm thinking, what are you talking about? All this work I did, I finally get it right. I've got it done. Things are going okay, and now you want me to kill my child? That's how I would react. Now, I also know, I know some of you well enough to say, you would say, no, 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 no. Everybody say no. No, I'm not going to do it. He keeps sending Abraham storms so he can learn. He's been chasing so many storms he could be on the Weather Channel. I just did that an hour ago, and everybody was looking at me like they never even heard of the Weather Channel. So he's got this knife up here. He's gonna kill his son. You know why? Abraham has learned some lessons. He has learned some lessons. He knows that over the past 30 years, that every time he tries to do it on his own, it doesn't work out. He found out that God is a just God and a giving God. And he remembers every time, I said every time, everybody say every time he resists God's direction, he gets into trouble and stuff falls apart when he's trying to be entirely in control. He also learned what we need to learn here today. Storms can produce some chaos in our life. Things get so scary when we're in the storm. But when we focus on God and remember, I can't even say this without crying anymore just because of everything God has done in my life, because God is in control. God is in control. We'll not only get through the storms, but it's better on the other side. Isn't it always better? Who here, raise your hand if you have not made it through one of your adversities in your life. You can't because you're here. You made it through every one. The people that ain't here didn't make it. You made it. Everybody say God is good. I thought they could go on with that. He's been teaching them, but they just haven't got there. When the rain stops and the thunder stops and the sea subsides and the flooded streets clear, everything gets better. All right, let's get back to the knife, because I know y'all always wonder what's happening. So he's standing there. I'm watching this movie called Game of Thrones. Anybody know this Game of Thrones movie? I just happened. I'm doing this class, and they keep talking about how well Martin writes and all the different aspects of it. So I go get the book, and I'm reading the book, but I'm always on the run. So I said, well, somebody told me there's a video, so I watched the video, and I was, oh my goodness, this is crazy. But anyway, in this thing, they had these knives. Back in those days, they made on knives. They had these bone knives, and in this movie, they have knives made of ice. They have all these cool knives. So I imagine this knife that he's holding up over his son is this big, wicked knife, and he's coming down. He's ready to pierce the boy's heart. His son, his only son. Over and over and over again, God wants to make sure when he's talking, he says his only son. He's almost there. And what does God do? God does God stuff. God's always there if we're listening. Genesis 22:11 says, but the angel of the Lord called him from heaven and said, Abram, Abram. And he said, here I am. He said, do not stretch out your hand against the lad and do nothing to him, for now I know you fear God. Fear here means respect, that I know that you trust me. I know that you fear God since you have not withheld your son from me, your only son, he keeps saying. And it reminds you of another time somebody's only son was not almost sacrificed, but was sacrificed. Jesus. The scriptures say he tested us, or tested him. He said that the scriptures say that he was taken to the ultimate test of his life. Not only was it just a present God gave him, it was his child. Storms in our life are to test us. When did tests come? After the teaching and training. The tests come at the end because you have to, if you don't know, how do you get a test in the beginning? They come after the teaching and training. God schooled Abraham and Sarah for 30 years. They flunked test after test. God wants to give them this present. He has this great present, the son, and then this nation after nation. But he wants to make sure they're ready. He wants to make sure that they will trust him in the future. God tests us and trains us and puts stores in our life so that we will trust him. And he wants to make sure they're mature enough not only to trust him, but set that example. And us as Christians, that's our job, to set the example for all people. Today, Abraham passes this test, and then God continues to deliver the promises to him. He uses those same storms in our life today. Maybe he doesn't use a child in our life, but he puts adversity in our life so that we can learn. And he knows how much we can handle. And sometimes I think he thinks I'm stronger than I am because he gives me a lot. But he's brought me through it every time. He'll bring us through it every time. God uses the storms of our lives to shape and strengthen us. We can endure those storms, we can run from those storms, or we can try to do stuff our own way. We want the flowers and the rain and the clean streets and the beautiful smell that's after rain, but we don't want the hard rain, we don't want the lightning, we don't want the fierce winds, because they scare us. I'm scared. The winds. It's going to roll me over into the river. It's going to tear up my car. There's all kinds of storms in the Bible. There's another story in the Bible about a storm. There's a guy named Pastor John Ortberg. He wrote a book. If you want to walk on the water, you gotta get out of the boat. We could talk about walking on the water. We can pretend about walking on the water. But if you want to walk on the water, you got to get out of the boat. Anybody remember the story? I know you remember it. God uses the storm of our lives to shape us and strengthen us. Matthew 14:22. Everybody say immediately. Immediately as he made the disciples go into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side of the lake he's talking about. Then he sent the crowds away, and after he sent the crowds away, he went up to the mountain by himself to pray. And when it was evening, he was there alone. But the boat was already a long distance away. It was far from land. Everybody say far. It was far from land. I shouldn't have turned away when I was reading, should I? He said, it's far from land, and it's battered by the wind and the waves, because it says that the wind was contrary. I know what that is because my mom and my grandma, my neighbor, they always said I was contrary. The wind was contrary. It was storming up. It was a really bad storm. Did I mention, if y'all heard me preach before, that the disciples are not the brightest bunch? No, they're not. Anyway, so here he comes across the waves, and they say, they're afraid. It's a ghost, they say. They see him above the waves. They freak out. And Jesus says, listen to me, immediately. Say immediately. He said, take courage. Do not be afraid. And then Peter's into it. You know Peter, he's kind of impetuous. He says, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. And he said, come. And then Peter got out of the boat, walked on the water, and came towards Jesus. He's walking on the water. But seeing the wind, he became frightened. He was scared. He began to sink, and he cried out, Lord, save me. And immediately, say immediately. Jesus stretched out his hand and took a hold of him and said, you have little faith. Why did you doubt? Then they got in the boat, and the wind stopped. Ooh, the wind stopped after they got in the boat. And then everybody in the boat worshiped him. Now they worship him. You're certainly the Son of God. Jesus uses the storms in our life to strengthen us. If I was Jesus, I got in that boat, I would have slapped every one of them. You know, how many times I got to tell you I'm the Son of God? God is talking to you. Anyway, so when did trouble start? When the storm started? No. When they lost sight of Jesus, he's been gone a long time. They're starting to freak out. He don't see him. There's a storm. They're afraid. And that's the same with us. When we let go of the sight of Jesus, when we get him out of our everyday thinking, when we're watching 27 episodes of the Game of Thrones and we're not in the Bible and then something happens, the first thing we think about is long knives that look like ice instead of thinking about Jesus coming into our life, because we are where we think. Jeff was just talking about our money. Our money is where our heart is, where we're thinking of. You say, you know, I don't have enough money to give to the church. I said, well, why not? This is Jeff talking to me. He said, because I need a new phone. The phone costs $700. He said, he didn't really say this. I'm making this up, but it's the same thing. If I got the brand new phone, this is a broken one. I still do the phone. Whatever we love the most is what we have. How big is this TV in my house? How many cars do I have? That's where we put our love, is where we put our money. We got to keep Jesus in sight. Jesus is setting up lessons here. He could have just ridden in the boat, because we know Jesus can sleep in the boat. There's another story. Jesus is nodding in the boat. There's another storm. But he lets them get far ahead. Everybody say far. He's setting up this series of lessons for them in the storm. So he lets them get far ahead. Why? So there's no doubt that he's walking on the water. He's not in the shallows. No one can say he was walking on perfectly placed stones, although we've heard that before, because they were far ahead. Not only far ahead, they're in a bad storm. Waves crashing, swells, dips, everywhere. It's crazy. And Jesus just strolls out on the water. The storm is bad. Say, how bad is it? The storm is bad. It's really bad. They're freaked out. How do we know it's really bad? Because they're freaked out. Well, a lot of people get freaked out, but these are boat people. Most of these people are fishermen. They've been out in storms before. So it's got to be pretty bad to be upset. Here comes Jesus walking on the water. So why is that important? He's far away. He's walking on the water. Because the dude's walking on water. He's in command of even the elements. All of the world is his dominion. He has control over it. They think because he's on the water that he's a ghost, and they get us scared. That's my word of the day. I've read the word and it says he is frightened. When I'm scared, I'm scared. I'm not frightened. You know what I'm saying? He's like, well, I'm frightened. That's when you're talking about what happened. When it happens, you go, it's a ghost. He tells them, do not be afraid. Now, I know you have this acrostic or whatever thing is in there, but I want you to write across the top of it, do not be afraid. Seriously, if you're ever going to get a tattoo, that's the tattoo to get. Put it right there on your hand. So when you're afraid and you're going, you can see it. Do not be afraid. It's a promise from Jesus that while we're on our storms, while we're on earth, we do not have to be afraid. If. Isn't there always an if? Always an if. This next lesson about Jesus is going to teach us is going to take care of that if. So here we are. Peter's like, this is cool. Okay, this is cool, bro. And they were just taken out there. That's the neatest thing I've ever seen. You're walking on the water. Let me walk with you. And Jesus says, come on. Jesus does the exact same thing to us. Whenever we want to conquer a fear, we talk to him, and he says, come on. He's going to take care of us. One thing I want you to notice with this story, he does not calm the sea before this lesson. To me, this is of magnitude importance in this passage. First, he could have rode with him. He didn't ride with him. He set these lessons up far in advance, back when in John 1:1. He doesn't calm the storm. He says, come on. The wind is contrary. The waves are all over the place. If they're scared it's a bad storm, he tells him, come on. He steps out. He's looking at Jesus. He's walking on the water. Then he looked in the waves. He started to sink. He took his eyes off the prize. It's the same with us. We take our eyes off Jesus, and when we do, when we let him get far away, when he gets away from us, when we don't have in front of our mind, when we're not doing our studies every day, when we're not thinking about Jesus, when we're not helping other people on purpose in his name, he gets far away, and we start to sink. What does Jesus say? What does Jesus do when he starts to sink? He grabs him. How fast? Immediately. Everybody say immediately. The same promise for us. When we mess up, again, we're going to mess up. And if you're like me, you're going to mess up all the time. When we call out to him, he immediately grabs us. He doesn't practice tough love. He doesn't wait till Peter goes down and he's bubbling for the third time. And that last bubble comes up and goes, Pop, help. He don't do that. Immediately. I don't even think he got the top of his feet wet. Immediately. He does that for us too. That's the if. We keep our eyes on the prize, we don't have to be afraid. Have you ever done that? Have you ever been in a situation, either one, where it's been so rough that you were freaked out, you were afraid, and you try to take care of it yourself? That didn't work. You tried to run from it. That didn't work. You tried to hide. It didn't work. And then some point, when we get what we call rock bottom where I come from, but it doesn't matter. Wherever it is, when the life gets so tough, when we become so afraid, we cry out, Jesus! What does he say? Come on. Come on. When does he do it? Immediately.